So what you find is programs all over the world. We have programs which are trying to target poor people. So you get people who are receiving benefits, and you get poor people. And again, there should be an overlap. There will be an overlap in 99% of cases. But it's not always 100% overlap. So in the middle, you have poor beneficiaries, which is the target group. But you also have some people in that category C who are not getting benefits. They're excluded. They don't get reached by the program. On the other hand, you have some people who are included who possibly don't need to be included, who might be non-poor. So what you get when you do targeting is you actually create three groups of people. You get the correctly targeted poor, you get the incorrectly included, which is the inclusion error, and you get the incorrectly excluded, which is those that are left out who are poor, who should be benefiting. And sometimes exclusion can be deliberate in the sense that you don't have enough resources to reach everybody, so it's a pilot project or it's only in some districts and it's going to scale up and roll out later on. So it's under coverage rather than error. But nonetheless, it's a real challenge to reach all the poor, given that most programs do have some level of either inclusion or exclusion error or both. Which error should we minimize? As policymakers, which is more important, inclusion error or exclusion error? If you're the Ministry of Finance, you're probably going to say inclusion error, because you don't want to waste money on people who don't need it. But if you are following the principle of leave no one behind, you would minimize exclusion error. You want to make sure that everybody is reached who should be reached. And that's the challenge. There's no perfect solution to targeting. It's a trade-off. So let's look at a couple of mechanisms that are used. Let's start with geographic targeting. Very common. It's very easy and cheap to do geographic targeting. You look for the poorest part of the country and you send your programs there. If you look at this map of Nepal, which shows the 5 main regions by the percentage of population who are poor in each of those regions, I think you can all agree that you would probably target the far west, right? The far west has got the highest proportion of poor people, 45.61%. And many programs do go to this part of Nepal because of this high level of poverty. As you can see, it's the highest rate by far of any of the 5 regions of Nepal. But there's a problem with doing geographic targeting. It's simple and cheap, but it's not very accurate. And the reason for that is because of the population density in Nepal, which is actually the reverse of that map. So if you look at the actual numbers of poor people in Nepal, you'll find much more poor people on the east than in the far west. In fact, the far west has got the smallest number of poor people because it's got the smallest population. Okay? Most of the population is concentrated in the central region around Kathmandu, and that's where you have 8 million poor people. So you're missing out all those people if you do geographic targeting. So the far west has actually only got 9% of the poor, whereas the central region has got 35%. Let's move on to categorical targeting. Categories of vulnerable groups are often chosen for targeting because they seem to be very easy to reach and obviously in need. Children like orphans, older persons, persons with disability. And this is a very good way of doing targeting. It's also very easy to do. It doesn't take very much to identify those people, but you don't need to know their income, for example. But of course, not everybody who is a child or an older person or person with disability is poor. So you have that challenge again of inclusion and exclusion error. And what about the working age adults who are unable to find a job? What about the unemployed? They tend to be left out of these vulnerable groups targeting. The next one I'm going to talk about briefly is proxy means tests. This is a very popular way of trying to assess household well-being without actually looking at their income. You look, for example, at their housing conditions. Do they have access to electricity, running water, indoor toilets, and so on? So you use a poverty scorecard to do this assessment. And one thing that's very commonly used is the quality of housing. So if you look at these 4 houses, I think you can probably agree very quickly which house should not be a beneficiary of an anti-poverty program. It would be the one on the bottom left, right? That house probably doesn't need a social grant or a cash transfer. The next one that you might eliminate from your list would possibly be the top right, which is a low-income, low-cost house. But actually, that's not 100% sure either, because sometimes you find an older, like a widow, for example, living alone in that house. Her husband has died, that bought this house a long time ago, and she has nothing left. So you can't just use a single indicator. You've got to use multiple indicators to do this kind of analysis, to do this kind of targeting. And you can see this very clearly if you try to compare urban poverty with rural poverty. So the man on the top left is living in an informal shack. It's not a very nice quality house, but he's got decent-looking clothes, he's got a house. Maybe he's not as badly off as the people on the bottom right. Those kids might be very poor, but they might also be the chief sons and daughters. They have shoes. This might just be their traditional housing. We don't know enough just by looking at quality of housing to say whether these people are poor or non-poor. So we need to be very, very careful when we do proxy means tests, just looking at indicators which are visible, but not necessarily actually measuring any type of income or well-being. The next one is self-targeting. Self-targeting is used most commonly on public works programs where people only turn up to do the work if they really need it. And the reason is because it's usually not very pleasant work. It's very hard work, manual labor, long hours, and also you get paid very little. So there's high access costs and there's low benefits. And the payment is kept low so as not to distort the market wages and so on. But there are questions, and public works is very common and very popular throughout Africa, and I actually support public works myself, but it has to be done in a decent work kind of way. Paying people below minimum wages is not necessarily ethical. It's not necessarily efficient in terms of reducing poverty either, because you are giving people very little income and expecting them to work very long hours, which they could be spending looking for work, looking for a job, or doing their own farming. So sometimes public works can actually achieve the opposite of what you intend. There was one story from Niger in West Africa where the public works wage was so low that people were spending more energy doing the work building the road than actually they got in the ration from the Food for Work project. So it cost them more to work on the project than they actually gained from working on the project. The last one I'm going to mention is community-based targeting, another very popular targeting mechanism. It relies very heavily on local knowledge. So the idea is that in a village, everybody knows each other. They'll be able to tell the World Food Programme or the government or any other external actor who are the poor in this village. And this is done by a committee or by doing participatory wealth ranking in the community. However, this has challenges. We know very well that this methodology is very popular and very widely used, but it is subject to elite capture, where some people can dominate those committees and can make sure that they and their friends and relatives get on the program. There are ways around this. You can divide the community into men, women, and then put the elites in a third group, and then they all come back together and compare their lists of the poor. So there are ways around that. I'm not saying that any of these methods are good or bad. They all have their benefits, but they all have their challenges as well. It's also difficult to compare community-based targeting across communities, so you can't really do it at national level because there's a relative ranking within the community. Okay, I've jumped very quickly through these 5 methods, the lessons that we've learned from targeting across the world. Basically, there is no perfect targeting mechanism. The only way you can reach everybody and leave no one behind is a universal program. But we can't always afford universal programs, so we do targeting. As you go from the top down to the bottom, down from geographic to categorical targeting, down to proxy means test and means testing, which is actually asking people their income, you find that accuracy tends to rise, but the cost also rises. It gets more and more expensive to do those very fine-grained assessments of household income. So you can do a cheap but not very accurate method, like geographic or categorical targeting, or you can go for a more detailed and accurate method, but it's going to cost a lot more to do, for example, means testing. Okay, I have a couple of minutes left to talk about my third thing, which is about policies and programs, my third theme, which is also a major theme of this conference. What are we actually going to do to address poverty and eradicate poverty? I'm going to talk about social protection. Social protection has become a big policy agenda in the last 20 years, here in Botswana and elsewhere. And this is not just an agenda for poor countries or for poor people. Social protection is for everybody. Everybody here who's got a pension or any kind of insurance is basically engaged in some kind of social protection. And in rich countries, social protection has played a major role in reducing poverty. If you look at these examples here, France and Sweden, if they didn't have social protection, social security, and redistribution through the tax system, their poverty rates would be up in the 30s. As it is, with these social protection mechanisms, poverty rates are under 10%. If you look at a country like the US, which, as we know, doesn't have such a well-developed social protection system, the impact on poverty is much less there. So the redistribution effect through social protection is actually quite limited. They reduce their poverty from about 25% to about 15%. But where you have very strong social protection systems, mostly in Europe, you find a massive effect on poverty through the transfers that are done by the state. One of the main lessons that we've learned from studying poverty over the years is that it tends to be transmitted intergenerationally. In other words, one of the best predictors of poverty is whether your parents were poor. It's very difficult for poor kids to escape from poverty. And that's because you don't see parents being able to invest in the health, nutrition, education, especially of their children. And so those children grow up to have low productivity in adult life, and they end up doing unskilled jobs, or they remain in smallholder agriculture, unable to get into the highly paid professional classes. So how do we break that cycle? Well, I'm going to talk now, finally, my last theme is about graduation models. Graduation models are an idea. I think we're going to talk about them later in the conference, so I apologize to anybody else who's going to be talking about this. I'll just talk about it for 3 minutes. The idea about graduation models is that people who are trapped in poverty can't escape. They're in a trap, which means that if they move slightly up the ladder to get out of poverty, they get knocked back. They have a health shock or a drought or a flood hits them, and they lose their animals, they lose their crops, they lose their income, their savings. So how can we get them out of poverty? How can we get them on a pathway out of poverty? Graduation model says we need to give people more than just cash transfers. They need other types of support as well. And if you can give them that package of support, they will be able to get above that line, which is not just a poverty line, it's actually an asset threshold. It's a minimum bundle of assets that you need to make a viable living. Then you can start to accumulate assets, and you'll have a resilience against shocks. So sustainable graduation is about getting people out of poverty and keeping them out of poverty, not just getting them above a poverty line, but making sure they can stay above that line when a shock hits in the future, so that they are resilient as well. And this is how it works in practice. The first thing is that this is the BRAC program in Bangladesh. They started it with the Targeting the Ultra-Poor program. They target the very poorest, the ultra-poor, people living so far below the poverty line that they cannot even get access to microfinance. And then they give them a package of support over a period of about 2 years, which includes consumption support in the form of cash transfers and food, training, an asset, a productive asset to make a living, and access to savings. And that package is actually a combination of social protection and livelihood promotion. So they're getting both cash transfers, access to savings, financial inclusion, which is social protection, and productive assets and livelihood training to get them out of poverty. So it's a combination of livelihood protection and livelihood promotion. So they start by doing community-based targeting. As I said, this can be challenging, but they do it in a very good way, I think. I've observed it. They involve the communities in selecting the poorest people in the village. They then give people assets, and the assets can be quite sizable. In this case, a cow, it's quite a sizable cow, and a goat. So this is not a cheap program. This is important to realize. It's quite expensive to do this. It costs several $100s. But the benefits are that people should be able to get out of poverty and stay out, so they won't need cash transfers for the rest of their lives. So in the long run, it might be actually cost effective. They get cash transfers and they get food as well. They're encouraged to save. In fact, they're actually forced to save. It's part of the culture of savings that's encouraged. So they give, for example, 200 taka and they give 20 taka back. So it goes into a savings fund. And the savings is very important against contingencies, against some shocks that might happen, and also to provide a working capital for their businesses. And then they get training. And the training is delivered by weekly visits by case managers from BRAC, and they talk to the household for up to an hour. And they help them with all kinds of things, not just their business, but also their financial literacy, business planning, but also household level issues that are affecting them and holding them back from achieving poverty, from getting out of poverty. I actually went there last year, and this is a picture that I took of a woman who had benefited from getting chickens, and she was trained in how to run a poultry business. She was given these chickens. She didn't know how to manage them. I wouldn't know how to manage chickens either, but apparently you need to be very careful how you manage them with temperature and feeding and water and so on, and she had done a good job of creating a viable business. But the other thing which is also very important in graduation programs, which is sometimes called the X factor, is behavior change communication. People are given information about good diets, about sanitation, like washing your hands, things like that, which are actually quite basic information that most of us have, but nobody's really taught people this. So this information is given to people so they can improve the quality of their diets, so they can do exclusive breastfeeding, and so that they can learn about the importance of washing hands before cooking, after going to toilet, and so on. And this has led to a significant additional benefit on top of the cash transfers and the assets. There's no doubt that that knowledge that people have has increased the number of people that have escaped from poverty and also from food insecurity. So the evaluations are very positive. You can see that the graduation model has led to increase in livelihood assets. This is the pink line shows the participants in the program. Of course, they were given those assets, so maybe that's a program effect. But if you look at household income, you can also see that income has increased faster than for non-participating households. The gray line are the control group. They've also done better because Bangladesh has been improving economically. but the graduation households have done much better in terms of overtaking those control group households in terms of income. And that's been sustained even 2 years after the program ended. So the first period is during the program, the last data point is 2 years after the program ended. So the benefits were sustained. This seems to be a sustainable approach which leads to resilience and poverty reduction in the long run. Most of the participants graduated. There have also been pilot projects around the world, and those pilot projects have also generated success. 75+% have graduated, which suggests this is not just a graduation-specific model, Bangladesh-specific model. It works in other countries as well. Good, so I'm now going to end. There was a bit of a rush to get through those topics, but I think it's designed to start the thinking around these issues.
Don't rush. Oh. I have another meeting in another part of the country.
Okay.
So thank you very much. I'm sorry to be so rude.
No, I'm sorry that I went over.
No, don't worry.
Thank you.
Please take your time. Don't rush.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Do I get to have the last slide or not? Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, His Excellency, please rise. His Excellency has to rush off to another engagement that he has to fly out to. This is why we had to just step in here and
to make a self-reliant living for themselves, even the extreme poor, by giving them the right assets and the right support in terms of training, literacy, numeracy, and so on, and information, actually. That's also a productive asset. That can make all the difference for them. Strengthen resilience through insurance mechanisms. One of the things that we find also with graduation programs is that poor people are very vulnerable to shocks. They don't have access to insurance, social security like many of us have. So a small shock can just wipe out all the gains that they've made over several years. So we need to strengthen resilience, and the best way to do that is to put insurance mechanisms in place. So it's not just about cash transfers, it's also about insurance and social security systems. Investing in human capital of the poor, that's always been there, especially education, but also health and nutrition. That makes people more productive in the long run. Strengthening institutions. As I said, from Brazil, we know that coordination across sectors and building strong institutions like a single registry where you have a database of all the program participants, those kinds of institutions are crucial to delivering effective pro-poor services. Reducing social exclusion and marginalization. When we talk about income, we tend to ignore inequality and class and other stratifications, discrimination against minority groups and so on. We need to look at the social dimensions of poverty, not just the economic. And finally, but not finally, empower women. The graduation program targets mostly women, and we know that mothers are the most important mechanism for getting well-nourished and healthy children. So empowering women is instrumental as well as an ethical thing that we have to do. So I think those are the key points that I'd like to end off with. Thank you very much. I'm sorry I went a bit over time.